Welcome to Safe on Deck. Episode 19 is part 1 of my interview with Chief Warrant Officer 4 Brandon Stites. Brandon enlisted in the United States Army in December of 1991 as an electronics warfare Intercept Aviation Systems Repairer. After applying for Army flight school no less than 4 times, Brandon earned his wings at Fort Rucker, Alabama, and was selected to fly the CH-47D Chinook heavy lift helicopter. Next, Brandon crossed over into the world of Army fixed-wing flying, where he flew the RC-12 N, P, and X Guardrail and the C-12 U, J, and V Huron, flying in combat over Afghanistan and Iraq. During his distinguished career in the cockpit, Brandon served in a wide variety of jobs, including as flight lead, operations officer, unit trainer, electronic warfare officer, training officer, senior instructor pilot, standardization instructor pilot, instrument flight examiner, maintenance test pilot, and maintenance officer. On the heels of a distinguished active-duty Army career spanning 20 years and 2 months, Brandon transitioned into the civilian aviation sector, where he flew as a helicopter EMS pilot, base manager, and regional aviation manager for the Medtrans Corporation. Brandon currently serves as chief pilot for Sherpa 6, a veteran-owned defense contractor specializing in ISR, logistics, and sustainment operations in support of the United States government. Thanks for taking the time to listen. In the future, I plan to continue to share similar interviews with both current and retired military aviators. If you have a question or a suggestion for a future interview, please leave it as a comment below. Safe on Deck, Episode 19, Part 1, with Chief Warrant Officer 4 Brandon Stites. Enjoy. Brandon, thanks again for making the time to do this. I really, really do appreciate it. Thanks. We had a wonderful dinner, wonderful, visit here in East Tennessee. I start these all the same way. I'll start yours that way as well. Where were you born?
I was born in Traverse City, Michigan.
Michigan, beautiful Michigan.
Yeah, northern Michigan.
How long do you all live there, your family?
Well, we lived there up until my 6th grade year. And then my dad, who was a tool and die by trade, but he was also a platoon sergeant in the local Army Reserve unit, and he had gotten laid off. The early 80s was pretty rough for everybody, but especially Michigan, and where he was working as a tool and die machinist was drastically reducing their workforce, and they built auto parts and tools to make auto parts. So he was laid off. And then one of his buddies, who was a recruiter for the Army Reserves, said, "Hey, there's a slot opening up. You should get on it." And it was a full-time. So he was an E7, Sergeant First Class, and he applied for it, got it. So he went from, kind of struggling to now he was a 14-year time in service E7. So our monthly income was drastically increased. But we had to move down to a town called Grand Blanc, which is just outside of Flint, because his recruiting station was in Flint, Michigan, which, we all kind of know what that means right now. But back then, really didn't know what it was like. And where I grew up, my daughter considers my hometown like Dawson's Creek, okay? Didn't realize how sheltered I was. So Grand Blanc, Flint was a different thing. We were there for 3 years. And then somehow my dad was able to get stationed back up to Traverse City. So we ended up back up into my little hometown of Elk Rapids. So I was born in Traverse City, which is the biggest town near, but my hometown is actually Elk Rapids. A town of, at the time, was 4,500 people, and that's where I went through grade school, graduated high school. So I graduated high school in 1991.
91. Okay.
Yeah.
I was born in 90. So
oh, nice.
We're putting some dates on the calendar. I like it. You mentioned the Army. Was that your first connection? Because I'm obviously, you went on to be an Army aviator, long, successful career in the Army. But where was that initial pull? Where do you remember thinking, hey, this is what I want to do as a career? Was it Dad because of his career? Well,
that was part of it. So, I grew up on the movies like Convoy, Smokey and the Bandit, Breaker Breaker, TV shows like BJ McKay and His Best Friend Bear. So I was going to be a truck driver. And so one of the things that my dad was doing as a recruiter, they had an air show every year at Bishop International Airport down in Flint. And with that air show comes everything with an air show. So his main thing was dealing with the U.S. Army parachute team, the Golden Knights. So my brother and I have a younger brother. He's 18 months younger than I am. It's just 2 of us. So we got to hang out with all those guys. And, of course, these were paratroopers, and these guys were just so – they were studs, but they were just, how old was I? So I would have been probably 11, 12-ish, and these guys were just – they were amazing. So we're at the air show, and the Blue Angels were there, and they were flying A4 Skyhawks, and I thought that was cool. I'm like, man, look at these are cool, and I would have liked to have talked to a couple of those guys, but when they came in, it was very rigid, and you couldn't get in, couldn't really talk to them, so I didn't really try. I was kind of like to me, it was like a professional sports figure, like a Billy Sims or something at the time, who was an awesome running back for the Detroit Lions. I digress. So, well, then a Huey and a Cobra come flying in from the Michigan National Guard. There was a National Guard base not far from there. And the sound that those helicopters made, of course, everybody knows what a Huey sounds like, and then a Cobra, same thing. Well, these things come swooping in and landed, and then these guys got out, and they came walking over to where we were because we were hanging out with the Golden Knights. And they were cool, and they came over to introduce themselves to us, and I was able to ask them a bunch of questions. And I was like, wow, these guys are cool. So I turned to my dad, and I'm like, how do I get to do that right there? That looks like that'd be pretty awesome. So that was the beginning. And then with my dad being a recruiter, I would go hang out in the recruiting station. And back in those days, the recruiting stations had these big 12-inch laser discs. And you could put these discs in, and you could look at every MOS in the Army. You could look at every duty station and how to get to that duty station, what jobs got you to that duty station. I mean, it was pretty. So I'd just sit there and I'd watch all these all the time. And I kind of figured out, I'm like, well, you know what? I think I'm gonna do that. And then finding out how that was, the warrant officer program for the Army, they used to say a lot of, high school to flight school. We'll get into it, but that's not entirely true. Sometimes it works out. But in a peacetime Army, which in my case, so I graduated in 91. So my senior year, I was already aligning myself to do that. I was setting myself up, and I was doing well in school. I wasn't really ready to go to college. I applied to two schools. I applied to Michigan State University and Western Michigan University. Western because they had an awesome flight program. And Michigan State because I just loved Michigan State. I'd been there a few times with some friends, and I had a lot of friends going there. I didn't know what I was going to study there. I just wanted to be a Spartan. But Western had the program that I would have signed up for. But didn't have the money, right? And I didn't apply for a ROTC scholarship. I probably could have, but I didn't, because in my brain, the shortest path to me being in the seat of an aircraft was the warrant officer flight program. So that's what I was kind of lining myself up for. So I got accepted to college, but I didn't register because I had gone through while I was a senior. So from the time I turned 17, my whole senior year, I started the packet. And back then it took about a year to put it all together because we had to manually type all the forms up, and then I had to go through a series of interviews. I had to go down to the MEP station in Lansing, Michigan, and face a board of 3 officers and answer a bunch of questions. And while I was in high school, I had tried to set myself up. So I was in student government. I was active in sports. I played football and baseball. And I was a co-captain on the football team. So I knew that there was certain gates that would help my packet out, and for anything really future in life, whether it was going to go to college or anything else, trying to build that resume. And I had a little bit of help. My counselor was a good guy. He disagreed with me joining the Army. I made a mistake of coming home one night and telling my dad that my high school counselor told me I was making a huge mistake by joining the military and wasting my life.
Oh boy. Dad probably did not like that.
No, so the next day I heard a very familiar tone and voice in my counselor's office, and I was like, ooh, keep walking. So, that didn't go well. But anyway, so I graduated. Everything was great. And everybody had told me, so back in those days, I don't remember what test you took, but the flight aptitude selection test.
Yeah, it's changed names for us too. But yes, I know what you're talking about. It's a very basic.
It was a very
exam.
basic.
Yeah.
It was back then. It was the AFAS. It was like an alternate flight aptitude selection test, and I think you had to score a 90 back in those days. And of course, I had bought a book. One of the guys from the Michigan National Guard unit that my dad was talking to was like, "Hey, he needs to study this book." So I did. I was studying it, but a lot of it made sense, right? If you follow airplanes or even helicopters. And once a helicopter's in forward flight, they operate just like an airplane does as far as attitude and the position of the airplane. And then a lot of the mechanical movements and stuff like that for your coordination. Well, I ended up scoring like a 131 on this test, which was the highest score that the Michigan had seen at the MEP station there. So, of course, 17-year-old Mr. Football guy, I'm like, oh, I'm in. Like, I am so in. So I was fully expecting to be in flight school that summer. But then the board got delayed. So the first board that I faced was in, I guess it was in either October or November. And I was qualified non-select, which I was like, wait, what? You told me I was going to, like, everybody at the MEPS, everybody told me that, oh, you're in. Well, I wasn't in. So if you don't get selected on the first board with that packet, it automatically goes to a second board. You qualify non-select, you go into the next pile for the next board. That was in December when the next board happened, and I was qualified non-select once again. So now I'm like, what the crap? I'm like, well, the Army's kind of ticking me off. So I actually did the one thing my dad told me never, ever, ever to do, and I went and talked to the Marine recruiter. Because I'd already taken all my tests, my ASVAB, all that stuff. And, of course, the Marine recruiter was like, okay, yeah, hell yeah. Of course, it's not the same thing. You can't pick your job, but I could pick aviation. But the thing was, so I didn't really have a job, and I was living, my parents at that time, my dad had gotten reassigned to the MEP station in Lansing. So we were living down in East Lansing, which really I was living on campus with all my buddies. It was fantastic. I was basically going to Michigan State, but not attending class. It was great. But the Marine recruiter he had me scheduled not to ship until like the following October. And I was like, well, that's not going to work. So I didn't join the Marine Corps. I went back, told the old man, all right, here's the deal. I need to enlist. So let's enlist, and I'll get a job in the Army, something that I can do that can help me make myself better to get into flight school, because that's still the ultimate goal. So I did. And I picked the MOS of, it was 33 Romeo. So it was Electronic Warfare Intercept Aviation Systems Repairer, which I'm like, wow, that's a mouthful for a job. What do you do? Well, he's like, you're an electronic warfare repair, so you fix all the boxes in the back of these electronic warfare airplanes and helicopters. I'm like, ooh, that sounds cool. Let's do it. So I signed up for it. I really didn't know what was involved in it with the security clearances and everything. So now I had to start this sequence of getting my top secret security clearance with sensitive compartmented information along with that. I mean, right out of high school, so you can imagine the battery of questions everything had to go through.
I wonder if it's almost easier, because on those questionnaires, you always have to name off like all the people, 10-year history, 20, whatever it is, history. That young, it's probably a pretty short list. So.
Well, that was easy, but the hard part was I had a interviewer once I got into boot camp, because you have to do it again once you get in boot camp. And okay, so my dad was at the time an E7, and he was a platoon. The guy he's like the last Boy Scout. I mean, the guy, he's never had a speeding ticket. So I drank beer a lot my senior year. Okay. So I enjoyed myself my senior year, but I was locked down until my senior year, and I enjoyed myself. I didn't get in any trouble. I knew what, we went out into the woods and built fires and drank beer out in the woods. And then we came back the next day. Anyway, so I had an interviewer that just could not accept the fact that I had never tried marijuana. She just would not accept it. And it was like, what do you want from me? And that caused a whole nother issue that worked out in my favor. But it was just, I grew up with somebody asks you a question, you answer the question honestly, and that's the end of it. Well, I was rapidly learning how sheltered I was up in northern Michigan and how the real world operates. So long story short, I went to basic, and that was in Fort Devens, Massachusetts for a year at the military intelligence school, and it was a joint school. So we had in our quad of 4 large barracks buildings, the old 3-story, 3 big wings, I guess you could say. The Army had 2, the Air Force had 1, and the Navy had 1. Of course, the Air Force kids were getting paid like an extra, back then it was like $220 or $230 a month for substandard housing. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Well, I totally joined the wrong service, but I digress. That's not the first time I would think, damn, I joined the wrong service. All kidding aside. So I was there for a year, which was cool. Intense. It was an intense school.
Is it academic? Is it hands-on? What kind of training?
It's both. So you go right into all kinds of electronic theory. You start off in DC because it's fairly simple, then AC, then digital, and then you start diving into how to properly diagnose electronic failures. And I'm talking down to the microchip and how much amperage and voltage in and out of whichever gate of this chip. I mean, I've forgotten pretty much all that crap, but it's Ohm's law, a lot of math. You have to figure out the proper energy of the components that you're testing. Hell, just learning how to use an oscilloscope is a week-long class. Because if you don't get that right, then from that point on, you're in big trouble.
Garbage in, garbage out.
And that ate a lot of people's lunch, myself included. But then we got to like reel-to-reel machines. They don't use those anymore, but they were still training on those. And it culminated with they had some big mission trainers that were based on aircraft in the field. And the biggest one they had was the Quick Fix, which was the EH-60 Alpha Black Hawk-based system that did DF jamming and intercepting of communications intelligence.
I want to make sure I unpack some of the terms. DF, direction finding.
Sorry, yep, you're right. Yep, direction finding and, the thing jam. So it did the three big things in one package. But they had a really great trainer there. And I was like, man, I hope I don't get assigned to this unit. I want to go to like a Mohawk unit someplace or something, because the Army still had some pretty cool airplanes back then. They had the Mohawk, and then they had the every version of the C-12, RC-12.
How do you end up deciding where you go? Is it something you're competing with other members of your class, or what's that process like?
That's a great question. So that's times I was looking at those laser discs in my dad's recruiting office. I noticed a place called Fort Carson, Colorado. And I was like, that place looks cool as crap. So I actually put that on my request on I forget the form. It was a Department of the Army form, if I remember correctly. And you can put on there, where do you want to go? Most people are like, like I have a choice. I actually put on there Fort Carson, Colorado. So I got assigned Fort Carson, Colorado. Everybody else in my class. So these are very small classes. I think I had 5 people in my class. They all went to Korea. And I got Fort Carson, Colorado, and they're like, Stites, how the hell? I'm like, did you guys put anything on your request? I didn't know you could do that. I'm like, well, because you should have been in a recruiting station looking at these laser discs, because that's how I, figured that one out. So I left Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and went to Fort Carson, Colorado, and I was absolutely amazed out there. But it was a very strange time, too, because this is 1993. So 92, 93, I was in Massachusetts going to school. So the fall of 93, I'm in Colorado. And back in those, I keep saying back in those days, back then, the Crips and the Bloods, this is, you were talking about crazy stories. In the replacement battalion, young soldiers like myself, I showed up there as an E3, so a private first class. And because I joined the Army, I forgot to left that out. I joined as an E1, like slick sleeve, nothing, very bottom. So I show up there as E3, and we're told not to pick soldiers up. It's called the banana belt, but it's the main drag where all the motor pools for the tanks, because the 4th Infantry Division was a mechanized infantry division with all the hardware. And by the way, they were just getting rid of their M60 tanks and taking delivery of their M1s, and this is in 1993.
M6, oh my gosh.
M60 A3s, if I'm not mistaken. So, but we were told not to pick up soldiers because soldiers were being killed in the barracks between Crips and Bloods.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it happened twice while I was there. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. We're in the United States Army. So needless to say, I didn't pick anybody up. And I went out to my unit, and it was a combat aviation battalion back then. It was like kind of a precursor to what we got going on right now. So now they're combat aviation brigades that happened after 9/11 and the wars, and they redesignated Army Aviation. But this was a company within that battalion, and it was a very unique company. It had one platoon of Quick Fix, the EH-60 Alphas, which I was there as a maintainer, and then we had a platoon of UH-1Hs that was general support to the commanding general of the division. So he had his pilot and his helicopter out of that platoon, an old Vietnam veteran W4. I can't remember his name, but his face is just, the guy didn't talk much and he would just stare at you, and it scared the crap out of me. Of course, everybody smoked like crazy back then.
The aircraft had ashtrays in them, as I recall. So.
Yeah, well, even the Chinook had them, even when I was flying them, which was insane. But and then we had a platoon of DeVarty support OH-58 Alpha Charlies. The most, I mean, still an OH-58, and this is pre-D model Kiowa days. These are old, gutless, the ones we flew in flight school, on a hot summer day with 3 people in it, your time limited operation. But it was cool because it was single pilot. So it was the last vestige, is that a word? Last?
I think it is. I know what you mean.
Of single pilot flying in the Army. So you could single pilot fly the 58 and the Huey. And that was it. So the rest of the division was full of, we had Cav Squadron. I believe it was 110. I think it's 1st to the 10th Squadron. The old Buffalo Soldier Cavalry Squadron. And then there was Attack Battalion. And then there was a couple of assault battalions. So you had Apaches and Black Hawks. And there was a Chinook unit there. I'm trying to think who they were assigned. It may have been a reserve unit. I think it was a reserve unit that had active duty augmentees.
How many helicopters in total are we talking about here?
For the 4th ID?
Yeah, just ballpark. I'm trying to put kind of numbers to it because I know what we have now, but obviously things have changed in terms of force. Force build-out.
I would say probably somewhere between 75 and 100, I'd say, probably total.
That's a lot of aircraft.
But, it was strange because, we had the Hueys and the 58s, and then we had they were just starting to, there was 2 hangars full of Cobras. They had just shut the Cobras down.
These be Foxtrot or Golf models?
I think they were Sierras.
Oh, really?
I think they were S models, if I remember.
So they'd sunset those as the Apaches were coming on.
Right, and the Apaches were coming online.
Wow.
So, 75 might be a high number. If there was one lift assault battalion, an attack battalion, a cavalry squadron, and then our combat aviation battalion, maybe 60 something.
Okay.
Something like that.
A large variety, lots of different types, lots of different missions.
Yeah, this was back when there was this craziness.
The EH-60 doesn't even exist, I guess is what I'm trying to, now.
Yeah, now that's gone.
So much different variety.
And that thing was such a pig. It was an Alpha Model 60, and it had all this gear inside of it that was heavy. And I remember taking off from the FARP, the Forward Army and Refueling Point that we had right there on the base at, I think it was Butts Army Airfield, and it's a mile high. It's at 5,300 feet, I think, or 52 something feet. Every time we came off the FARP, I didn't know much about flying back then, but I'd look up and I'd see yellow chiclets on the torque or temperature, depending on the time of year it was, I guess. But it was always like that. But interesting side story. One day I was walking to the battalion, and a UH-1 was short final for a spot right next to the battalion, and I was like, that helicopter's coming right into the battalion. They landed it. They started tying it up, and I looked at it, and the state of Michigan was on the door. It was a Michigan National Guard UH-1H, and it was being flown and parked as a static display.
And that's what inspired you to join.
They flew it in. Yeah, I'm like, holy cow, look at that. I don't know if it was the same tail number, but it was just weird because I'm like, oh, my God, that's a Michigan National Guard UH-1. So
that's crazy. Aviation is a small world.
It is a small world, and I'd also kind of talk a little bit about like the Army and how they bring up soldiers and future leaders. So I showed up out there, and my squad leader grabbed a hold of me, and because I was trying to do what I was there for, and I knew that I wanted to do what I had to do to improve myself, because obviously I wasn't good enough to get into flight school the first time. So I'm like, what do I got to do to make myself better? So this sergeant helped me, and I volunteered for a bunch of stuff. I was going to the Soldier Month boards, and I was doing very well at all that. And they put me up in they started giving me extra jobs, and then I made E4, but it's not below the zone, but I got it early. They could have, here's the crazy part, I would have automatically got it a month later. But the first sergeant was like, I was doing above and beyond. I wasn't kissing ass or anything, but I was busting my ass, okay? And he's like, no, I don't care if he gets it automatically the next month. He's getting that promotion ahead of these other guys that could have gotten it way earlier. So that was cool, because
you remember that when someone
you remember that, and you're like, wow, I didn't bust my ass for nothing. And so it was coming up. There was I wanted to put another packet in for another board. I'm like, all right, so now I'm in the Army. I'm an actual soldier. I've been doing all these things. I'm doing really well. We went to our first field problem, and I was the unit armorer. So I got to go out in the ADVON, the advanced party, and they put me out there in a UH-1. One of the cool TV shows I remember as a kid was Tour of Duty that was on. It was a Vietnam TV show, Vietnam War TV show. And these guys are flying around in UH-1s everywhere, hanging out the doors. I was going out to the field with an M60 mounted in the door of this UH-1, and I'm hanging off this thing with like a lap belt. And we were getting it. The guy was flying NOE, and I'm like, oh man, this is what exactly it was where I wanted to be.
You say NOE, nap of the earth. How low are we talking? Like over the ground?
We were below the treetops when there was room to put the helicopter there.
That's awesome.
So
yeah, that's the way a helicopter in many ways is meant to be flown.
Yep. Yeah, and they weren't hot dog and crazy stuff because that's the unit had just had a Class A about 8 months before I got there. And the guys were too low, and they contacted the ground with the main rotor at 100 knots.
You're not going to probably
there was nothing
come back
left.
From
Yeah,
that. Yeah,
no.
Yeah.
And the lieutenant flying had just married Miss Colorado. I remember that part too. It was sad. It was very sad. So,
gosh.
But also these guys, like everybody in the OH-58 platoon, they were like W1s. It was like they took a whole flight school class. Here you get 58s. And there was a bunch of W1s in the UH-1.
So very
platoon.
Young
so
folks.
young guys. Yeah.
More experience.
Right. But the field problem went great. And I had to go to, we did operations down at a place called Pinion Canyon. It was kind of like a local version of NTC. Everybody went down there for exercises.
NTC, National Training Center. That's Fort Irwin?
National Training Center is Fort Irwin, California.
Okay. Yeah,
yep.
So just a smaller version of that, basically.
Mojave Desert. Yep. This is a training area down in the southern part of Colorado. It's still a desert. I mean, it's the first time that it was raining out there, and we were living in GP medium tents, and, the mud was clumping up on, 8 inches underneath my boots, and you can't walk anywhere without scraping. I would see that again how many years later in Iraq. It was so awesome. Yeah. So it was a fun time down there, though. We flew a lot, and interesting enough, so the helicopter, we carried handheld plugger GPS units, and we would land somewhere. I would get out with the plugger to get a fix of where we were, and then the pilots would put it in their old piece of crap,
GPS, yeah.
INS.
Oh, INS.
Based GPS, or Doppler based GPS unit that, drifted like crap. Anyway, just those things that come running back when I think about it. It was crazy, but it was a fun time. And that's the first time I was someplace where a soldier was reported killed in a field problem. And I was like, wow, like the first time I actually heard of an actual guy dying in a training accident. 2 truck drivers in a 5-ton truck, and if you've been into a military vehicle, they all have hand throttles that you are not supposed to use as a cruise control. Well, these guys were, and they took a corner too fast, and they wrecked it, and the spare tire went through the cab and tore one guy pretty much in half. So I'm like, holy cow, well, I guess this is no kidding. And I also remember one time we were going to the field out there, and we were in Cut V, the old pickup truck. So GM pickup trucks. We had Cuck Vs, which was the Blazer, and then the Cut V was the 1-ton full-size Chevrolet truck. They were complete junk. I hate to say that because I used to be a GM guy. 6.2 liter naturally aspirated diesel motor that didn't have enough power to do anything. Anyway, we were on the way out to the field, and ours caught fire. And I was with my squad leader, Sergeant Ron Smith, to be exact. And we got the fire extinguisher. We put the fire out, so we were waiting for recovery. Well, we didn't realize there was a battery of Paladin 155 millimeter howitzers across the field behind us, and they started shooting. If you've never been under 155 millimeter cannon being shot, wow, that was quite the experience. And then after they got done shooting, we actually walked over there, and the guys gave us a tour of the thing. It was pretty cool. It's, a huge, big tracked turret cannon howitzer. It was awesome. So while this was all going on, my packet was back in, and came back, qualified non-select once again. And I was like, gosh, dang. So between the first board and the second board of my second packet, I came down in orders for Korea. I was like, ooh, well, I thought I was getting over, but apparently not. So I was right behind my friends that I was in school with. And that was my first duty assignment, the Army, if you're a single soldier, you get 12 months at your first duty station. So I was only there like 7 months, and then boom, I'm going to Korea. I'm like, you guys. Okay, so right before I left to go to Korea, I found out I was a second time qualified non-select on that second packet. I'm like, oh my gosh, you're killing me. So I PCS to Korea, and I went to the 3rd Military Intelligence Battalion at Camp Humphreys, Korea, South Korea, obviously. It's at Desiderio Army Airfield, which is south of Osan. It's in a town called Anjani or Anjanri, depending on which side you're looking at. And I was working on RC-12. I think they were Kilo airplanes, RC-12Ks, H's also. And I think the N's were just coming out. The N model RC-12s were just coming out with the new Guardrail. That was cool, and I actually was on flight status. So I was on flight status in the Black Hawk, and then I got put on flight status in Korea. And the good thing about the Korean assignment was my platoon sergeant in Korea was one of my drill sergeants at Fort Devens. So he knew me, and I kind of left out, but I was made the student first sergeant for the Army side while I was at Fort Devens, and typically you do that for a month or two. I was like the first sergeant for 7 months. It was crazy. But so he remembered me, obviously. He picked me up at the bus at the post and got me in my barracks room. And the next day was training, so I had to do some training. And then he grabbed me by the hand and took me to the education center. And I'm like, what are we doing? He goes, we're signing up for college. I said, what do you mean we're signing up for college? He goes, we're signing up for college. I said, both of us? He goes, yep. I'm like, okay, cool. So that started my college education, was him dragging me down there, which was awesome. So that first class we were in together, it was a history class. So I started kicking, working my butt off there also. Plus it was a new system that I really didn't know a whole lot about. And I started off on the flight line, actually working on the actual airplanes, which was fun. 2 big racks in the back, and I got to fly. I would freeze to death up on the track. We'd be flying anywhere from 28,000 feet. And, of course, the air conditioning is blowing back there to keep the equipment cool. And the cockpit was nice and toasty, and I'm freezing. So I always took a big sleeping bag up there with me. In those airplanes, there was a porta potty / seat in the very back of the airplane. So I could legally ride. So I did this flatline for a while. And while I was there, it's a cumulative, if you're enlisted, a cumulative time of flight status. After 12 months, you earn your wings. So I earned my crew member aviation wings, I was pretty excited about that. But we're doing lots of other stuff. And then halfway through my tour, I got reassigned to the Integrated Processing Facility part of the Guardrail system, the IPF, which is 4 40-foot vans connected, and it's all like NBC, positive air, vacuum kind of thing. So if we get an NBC attack, we're all protected.
Positive pressure. So
positive
if there's
pressure,
any kind of contaminant or like nuclear, biological, chemical.
That's it. Yep. So it's like, sci-fi movies.
Yeah.
And inside those vans are the analysts and the operators, because it's all linguists. Because this RC-12 system, the Guardrail system, is what's called an ARF. The actual airplane is a aerial remote or airborne remote facility, aerial remote facility. Anyway, the airplane, all the equipment is remotely controlled by the operators in the integrated processing facility. The pilots up front are just flying the airplane on a specific track, because usually 3 planes operate together in that system. And the guys on the ground are doing all the work. And the airplane just collects all the information, beams it down to a ground tracker via microwave data, and then it gets disseminated within the trailer. And the one trailer we inhabited was the brain of the whole system. It was a big concurrent computer corporation computer that we had to constantly maintain and work on and calibrate and all that stuff. And then when an operator spills their coffee or Coke all over their keyboard, then we had to go in there and fix that for them, which happened quite often. But it was a fun time. And while I was over there, I was like, man, I need to put another packet in, right? Because that's why I'm here. So I'm doing that. I'm putting the packet in. And it was towards the end of my tour that I got the packet submitted. And I was also selected I went to the promotion board for Sergeant E5. Yeah, so I was an E4. Obviously, I made E4 in Colorado. So I go there, and I was doing all the same things that started me on the journey. So I was trying to better myself and make myself more attractive to be worthy of going to flight school and being a warrant officer. And I remember one of the first sergeants of one of the other companies asked me what my future plans were, and I told him I wanted to be a warrant officer, and he dressed me down in my board because I was wasting his time, because I was there to try and get promoted to sergeant to be an NCO. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm like, this is not the type of leader that I had been exposed to up to that point. This is the other that I'd heard about. And I remember saying something like, I'm sure I was very, careful with the words I used, but it was something along the lines of, well, first sergeant, we're not guaranteed flight school. I've tried twice and been denied. Do you want me to maintain to be an E4 for the rest of my career? So you don't want me to try and advance? And then, of course, he was like, well, that's not what I'm saying. But I'm like, well, okay. Is there any other questions I might be able to answer for you? Like, I don't know, the max effective range of my primary weapon? That would be a pretty good question. No, I didn't say any of that. I was trying not to be a smart ass.
But this is a surprise. This is not the kind of leadership you've been exposed to.
Yeah, I was like, what the crap, man?
Yeah, those people exist, unfortunately.
Right. But luckily, our sergeant major was a really good dude. And, of course, my first sergeant was awesome, along with my platoon sergeant, Sergeant Grubb. So I did well on the board, believe it or not. That guy gave me high marks. And so I was recommended for promotion. So now you're waiting on points. Well, then I had to go to the first NCO school, which is called Primary Leadership Development Course, which in Korea you had a whole camp. It was called Camp Jackson. PLDC is a month long. And so I go up there with actually one of the linguists in my unit that we played rugby there, and my first exposure to rugby, which was fantastic. And we had a great time, and we killed it up there. And I found out while I was in PLDC that I was qualified non-select once again.
I want to keep track. Is this 4 or 5?
This is the this is the third packet, 5th board that I was told no. So I'm like, wow, man. And I was really close this time. This was 1995. So by this time, my dad had been transferred down to Fort Knox, Kentucky at Recruiting Command, USAREC. Well, the floor above him is where they do like selections for Warrant Officer Flight School and a bunch of other advanced schools and stuff like that. And he had made some friends, and basically had found out that I was number 14, and they took 12 dudes. Or ladies, I'm not sure at that point.
That's gotta hurt, though.
I
You're
just
so
missed it.
close.
I'm like, God, I wish you hadn't told me that now. I'm like, I should have been like last or something. So I was like, well, crap. And at the same time, I found out kind of what we were talking about earlier about the Navy won't PCS you with a certain amount of time.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, the Army sent me to Korea with less than 2 years left in my enlistment. It was actually, what would it have been? It would have been just shy of 18 months to be exact. So, of course, I'm coming up on my PCS, and the re-enlistment NCO, or there's another name for it, I can't think of it right now, but he found me. He goes, hey, specialist, we got a small problem here. I'm like, what's that? He says, well, you only have like however many 16 months left in the Army. And I was like, okay. Well, you can't PCS from Korea with only, 4 to 6 months stateside, so you have 2 choices. You can either stay here to that extra 4 months and ETS from the Army in Korea, or extend to meet the 12-month requirement to PCS. I'm like, well, I think I'm going to extend. So I did. And so I left Korea, came home. I was there the entire year of 1995, except for like the last, 10 days. I got there New Year's Eve, 1994. applied for and was granted a 10-day drop and left on December 21st of 1995. So it was kind of crazy. And a lot of crazy things happened while I was in Korea. Right before I got there, we had lost a Mohawk. The crew punched out. And then Bobby Hall, a warrant officer, had gotten shot down in the north. He was training a new pilot on the DMZ flight corridors, and he got lost. He was shot down, and the guy he was training was killed by the North Koreans. So, and then also while I was there, a South Korean fishing boat was ripped up by a North Korean patrol boat. We heard the whole thing go down live through our airplane because the guys were screaming on the radio. The Sampoon apartment building collapsed. That was big news back then. Also, the Oklahoma City bombing happened during that year.
As bad as it is to say, as a little kid, that's one of my first distinct memories that morning, seeing it on TV.
That was unbelievable.
Silly thing to kind of as a data point, but it's one of my first, like, I know exactly what that was. And seminal moment, I don't know if you want to call it that. But
no, it was crazy. And we also had a North Korean sub wash ashore in South Korea because they're always infiltrating South Korea, the special forces, North Korean special forces.
And when you say sub, you mean like a 2-man? I know they have like
it was a small,
a
small, almost like a SEAL, like one of those things they use to try and get in. Very small.
SEAL delivery SDV,
something like
SEAL
that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
so
their version of it. I'm sure it's not near as nice as ours, but
I would hope not. Yeah.
So they found those guys and they actually killed them. They killed one of them just outside of Camp Humphreys. Somehow he got onto Camp Humphreys, and they actually fragged him with grenades in a irrigation ditch. It was unbelievable.
I think the thing to remember, though, and I think you're kind of illustrating it perfectly, that war, I want to make sure I say it right. There's an armistice, but it's not a peace accord. Like, we are still duty bound to help the South Koreans, and the South Koreans are still at war with the North Koreans. It's Cold War is maybe the right term. I don't know what the right term is, but the point is there's still active hostility in that part of the world between those two parties.
There's still firefights on the Z, no matter what anybody's. It's crazy. It's like they called it, you remember you reading about World War II, and after Hitler invaded Poland on the 1st of September of 1939, and then he took Poland in, 2 to 3 weeks, and then everybody declared war on each other, and then they called that the phony war for the next 6 or 8 months as Hitler was reconstituting, and the French were like, oh, are we, whatever. And same thing with the British. The British sent the expeditionary force across. And it wasn't until the following, I think, fall is when Hitler actually came across and invaded France through the Benelux. So I guess it's similar, like a phony war. They're at war, but there's still bullets flying, and there's still active insurgencies into the south from the north.
From your job, and I want to say reconnaissance is maybe the wrong word, you're still, I understand you're not, in the front of that airplane, but you're still very tied into that process. Did it feel real? Did it feel like something that, I think the term I've heard the Air Force use is ready to fight tonight, one of their wings, I think that's their motto. Is that something you all felt as well? That was what you all were there to do, is defend South Korea? Yes,
but at the same time, I was 20, I had just turned 21, so 21, 22, I turned 22 while I was there. It was still, I felt like I was still trying to learn my job, and, all that war stuff was still like, it wasn't sinking in. It's kind of like, I won't want to call it a video game because, video games were still in their infancy back then, thank goodness. But our leadership made sure, I'll tell you what brought it home was, one of the things in our airplane, and I'm pretty sure this is all open source because this stuff's all old. So we had a teletype piece of equipment. It was called the ICTT, Improved Commander's Tactical Terminal. And that was up at the bunker up north and man, I can't remember where it was, either in TDC, which is Tongduchan, or Camp Red Cloud, or it was the big bunker where the wall, the map on the wall was where everybody was. And it was where the bigwigs hung out. And that's where that ICTT was. And for some reason, the local, when I say the local, like the 100, I think it was the 102nd MI Battalion, whoever the folks up there were, they could never keep that thing properly keyed. And back then we used what was called a KY58. It was the first version of electronic cipher keys that was fed with a tape. Every day it was a tape, like one of those old pianos that have the auto like a...
It's like a little spool of paper with little
with holes in
dots
it.
on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what we used every day to fill our aircraft and our ICTTs with these radio fills.
The first generations of that stuff.
Unbelievable. So we would... The fill piece of equipment, you would run the tape through that. Then we had to burn them in a can under witness and sign it, right?
Destroy it, yeah.
Destroy it. And then we would use that to actually fill the Kick 13 that has 6 separate selectors on there. And depending on where you were, what day, you would select that, and then you'd plug it in, and it'd blink a red. It was unbelievable. You think back compared to what we have now, and it's like, wow, how'd we do that? Well, they couldn't get it right up there for the ICTT. So one of the cool things we got to do is we'd load it up in a Ford van when we got to drive up there once a month, and we would fill that with the full month codes. And I remember looking up at that map and looking at all the artillery pieces that North Korea had facing to the south. I'm like, there's no way anybody's soul is going to survive any of this. But you also have to remember that when Seoul built all their apartment buildings, they built them to face the north in such a way that they would absorb a lot of artillery to help the people escape. Okay, so talking about stuff that has nothing to do with flying.
No, you're good.
I PCS'd.
Yeah, yep.
I go to Savannah, Georgia.
Savannah, Georgia.
Hunter Army Airfield, the Mighty 224 Military Intelligence Battalion, Aerial Exploitation Airborne. Because at that point, at that time, that unit was under the 525 Military Intelligence Brigade at Fort Bragg. So, and we were under the 18th Airborne Corps. So that was 30 MI and 224 MI were considered core assets because of the system. So the 224 is a core asset. So I show up there, which, by the way, Sergeant First Class Grubb, PCS right before I did. He's now my platoon sergeant in Savannah also. And a lot of the same people that I was in school with that we went to Korea or went to Carson, blah, blah, we ended up in Savannah. So it was good. And that was a better system. That was definitely N model RC-12s. The newer version, which is it's a King Air. On the books, it's considered a 300. So we get a type rating. Eventually, I would get a type rating after I started flying them. But it's a 200 fuselage, typical Army. It's a 200 fuselage with like pieces of the 1900, like wing, spar, gear, tail, and it has Dash 67 motors on it, PT6-67, which is 1,200 horsepower per engine with big, huge 4-prop Macaulay props on it. And that thing weighed 16,500 pounds or 16.2, if I remember. I can't remember the exact numbers. It was a heavy airplane for a King Air. But it was cool. So I went to the flat line when I first got there, and I made sergeant, which was pretty cool. And small side story, guess what? One day I didn't get paid. And I went to the S1, to the personnel section, and he pulled up my record. He goes, well, it says here, you're ETS. I'm like, you know what? Because when I first signed in the unit, I went to the retention NCO and said, hey, I had to extend in Korea. Are we good? Yeah, you're good. It's automatic. Yeah, automatic. Screw the soldier. That's how that works.
What's ETS? What's that?
I'm sorry. That was to get out.
Okay, so
honorably discharged.
That's why they're not paying you. They think you've gotten out of the Army.
Yeah, because Sergeant, you know who over in Korea
Bagonuts didn't
do his job. Yeah. And then when I got to Savannah, that dude's like, no, it's fine. I'm sure he did it. He didn't check.
Yeah.
So now I got a no pay due, and I'm a young NCO, and I had bought a new truck. Well, a new used truck. But I'm like, what the F, man? You know what F means.
I do. You don't have to translate that acronym.
I'm just kidding. No, so I had to unscrew that.
Yeah.
Which actually that turned out pretty good because I ended up getting all that back pay. So that was, a little bit of party time there. But I made a sergeant. So then I was doing all the right things. And I remember my battalion sergeant major was a cool guy, Sergeant Major Hibschman. He was very tough. So I was doing the solar NCO now boards and winning and doing all the right things, still going to college. And that was University of Maryland at that time, like worldwide campus, University of Maryland. And I was having fun, doing my thing, and then my real ETS enlistment was coming up, and I was faced with a decision. And in those days, the Montgomery GI Bill was what we had, which was $12,000, and that was it.
For education.
For education.
After your 12K, you're done.
After your 12K, that's it. And that was based on, it was good looking back on it, but compared to today's benefits, it's not even close, right? So for the first year of service, I paid $100, and after 12 months, I get $12,000. So that's a pretty damn good deal. But even back then, and so this was in 1996, the end of 1996. And I was like, man, so I could go back to Michigan State, but I'd have to, sell my truck and probably have to live with my parents for, I don't know, a month or two, figure things out. I'm like, that is not happening at this point in my life. I've been in the Army almost 5 years. I'm like, nope, I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to try flight school one more time. So I re-enlisted and started putting my packet together again. And believe it or not, that one got selected. I was selected for flight school. I couldn't believe it. It was awesome. I still remember the day.
Yeah, how are you notified? How do they tell you?
It normally comes down through channels, but I kind of learned at an early age in my Army career that it helps to know people in the right places. So my dad was still at USAREC. So he calls me. He goes, Brandon, they just had a board. I'm like, yeah. He goes, are you sitting down? I'm like, just tell me. So he told me, and it was unbelievable. It was awesome.
What a way to hear it from your dad too.
It was
so special. Yeah,
that was great. For him to be part of the whole thing. So we were on active duty together up until my last 8 years, which is kind of crazy. So I mean, I say that, but not really, because he had converted full-time recruiting. So he was at Fort Knox, and then he ended up going and running the record center at St. Louis as the NCOIC, and then he went back to USAREC to retire years later. So this is 1996. I get picked up. I was like, holy crap. So I'll leave in May of 97 to go to flight school.
Tell me about flight school.
Awesome. It was very intimidating. I'd worked my whole adult life to get there. Then I get there. Now I'm scared shitless. I'm like, oh my God, am I good enough? Am I going to make it?
Did you have any? So you talked about you had flight time. You'd flown in the C-12. You'd flown in the EH-60 Alpha. Had you ever flown up front? Had you ever had any hands on the flight controls before that?
That's a great question. While I was at Fort Carson, one of the pilots, her name was Leanne Freka. At the time, she was a CW2. I thought she was really cool. And she was out at the hangar one day, and she came up to me. Everybody knew I wanted to go to flight school because I was, I talked about it all the time. And she's like, hey, Specialist Stites, I have a sim period down here, and the simulator is right there on the airfield for the 60. And she goes, but the guy I was going to fly with can't make it. Would you like to sit the other seat for me? I'm like, and of course I was like, well, yeah, of course, but I don't know what to do. She goes, don't worry about it. It's mainly me doing a bunch of stuff. She was an instructor pilot. Come on in. I'm like, hell yeah. So I jumped in there, and she let me do quite a bit of flying. And I knew I knew how a helicopter flew, right? Because I'd been reading about it from the time I was like 12. So I knew what everything was supposed to do, but I'd never actually done it. And believe it or not, it's a simulator. So I did pretty well with it. Kind of looking, she was like, geez. I'm like, yeah, how about you help me get in flight school? Geez, oh, Pete, what's a guy got to do? So that was, to answer the question, I'd never been in front of an actual aircraft, but I did do the simulator, and I got to go to the air show, the annual air show at Atsugi Naval Air Station. At the time, it was a USS Independence, and the air wing was coming back. They were coming back from a deployment, and they're having a big party. Well, we sent 2 Mohawks and 1 RC-12, and because I was on flight status, they let me go. And we rigged up, I flew with a captain and a CW3, Mr. Smith. He was freaking cool as crap. Warrant officer, because warrant officers are cool as crap. This guy was extra cool. The captain was pretty tight, but Mr. Smith was badass. And he actually rigged up a seat so I could sit in between them en route. So that was cool, man, flying to Japan. And that was the first time I spent 3 full days completely intoxicated. The whole time, because of Mr. Smith, we got kicked out of the NCO club after the first night, got into a fight with Marines, almost went to the brig. It was a crew of, it was an EP3 crew that, all of us eggheads, electronic warfare people kind of gravitate together, and we'd hooked up with them at some point in the night. And we ended up at the NCO club, and we got in a fight with Marines. Big surprise there. And when the shore patrol showed up, their chief, he was the E7, chief petty officer, and the petty officer in charge of the shore patrol squad that showed up, basically the CPO was like, hey, we got these retarded Army dudes. We'll take them back to their... He goes, Chief, you promised me you're taking them back right now. I mean, I remember this. I was hammered, but I do remember because I was scared. I thought, oh, my God, I'm going to go to a Navy jail. It was a great time. We went back to the barracks, and the next night we hung out with Marine. It was a 53 squadron. And because I had made friends with the Lance Corporal, these helicopters they had gotten had 14 hours on them. Brand new Echo models back in the day. And that's the first time I had seen a swash plate on a effing...
Massive.
It blew my... I knew it a Black Hawk because I used to, as an electronic warfare guy, I was abused by the actual crew chiefs of the Black Hawks. Like, hey, get up. I need you to mix up my Pro Seal for me and crap like that because,
They're having you help out.
Yeah. I was the spark chaser, but they had me up doing 10 hours on a 60, greasings and shit. Anyway, looking at the squash plate on this 53, I couldn't even believe how big that sucker was. And inside of it, it was neat as hell. So that's my first experience with a 53 Echo. Anyway, so flying up front in that RC-12 was cool. The young captain, he ended up going to Captain Norris. He ended up going to Savannah also. And I'll talk about him here in a minute. So while I was working on a flight line up there, and I'd been selected to flight school. A couple of the pilots were going to run me to Fort Rucker on a trainer bird to show me around. Because we got a guy who's going to flight school. And that morning, I went out to the flight line, and the ground crew, our mechanics, they looked like something really bad happened. And something really bad did happen. A training flight. We had a new Chief Warrant Officer 3 that had been flying Mohawks his whole career. Had some C-12 time, but mainly Mohawks. We were transitioning out of the Mohawks at that point, in 1996, and everybody was put in RC-12s. And he was doing a training flight with Captain Norris. And apparently they were doing slow flight, and he stalled it and spun, and they went straight down. They found those guys in like an 8-foot hole in the ground. It was a perfect outline of an RC-12. The only thing left was the tail section. So that was my first death, knowing the people, my unit, the first memorial, all that stuff. I'm like, holy crap. And this is right before I'm going to flight school. Like, I've got a slot. I'm going to go fly, I knew I was going to get airplanes because back then you couldn't, as a warrant officer, you could not get selected fixed wing right out of flight school. But I just, of course, you'll never forget that stuff, right? And so I get ready to go. We did that one NTC. In the meantime, I did that NTC deployment, the National Training Center, that was supporting the experimental digital warfare from 4th ID. So we were flying out of Edwards Air Force Base, and that's when I got to witness the last missions of the SR-71 in person, which was mind-boggling. And for those aviation geeks out there, while we were there, the Air Force put us up on North Base in the hangar that the U-2 was developed in.
Wow.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
The history out there was absolutely insane.
Real quick, just since you mentioned the SR, what do you remember about it? I know you got to be very close to it just because of some of your ground duties. Essentially, you got to be really close to the airplane. Yeah,
I was very close. Just the sound. I'd been around other jets, and, we had done a deployment. We had done a Purple Dragon exercise the previous summer up at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, and that's an F-15E strike fighter base. And the sound of those things taking off in full burner would shake our tent because we were at the departure end of the freaking runway. I'd been around other jets and stuff, but this was different. This was when that guy brought the power up on that and then started rolling, and then the afterburners went. It was, I can't even describe it. It's kind of like seeing the Grand Canyon or, hearing Def Leppard live for the first time or, something, or Pink Floyd or whatever. It was, I can't describe it. It was absolutely incredible. And he came back, did a pass, and then he disappeared. And then after he got his gas, it was the boom boom of him breaking the sound barrier on his way to his mission.
That's cool.
It was cool. It was huge. It's the first time I'd seen one in person. I couldn't get over how big the airplane was.
I think I told you the story, just kind of a similar one for me. I got to see I think it was Discovery's, no, it was Atlantis' second to last, or penultimate launch. And I remember, actually one of the most patriotic things I've ever been a part of. We were all on the NASA Causeway, I think like T-minus 5 minutes or whatever. Like literally everyone sang the national anthem. It was kind of cheesy, but also kind of awesome, like just that America feeling.
It is.
And I remember when they launched, so obviously the SRB's light, so there's a plume. You can't see the shuttle for a brief moment as all that exhaust comes out. And the moment it cleared the exhaust, I felt the heat on my face.
Wow.
And we were 7 miles away.
That's unbelievable.
But yeah, you can't put that in words. You can't. Like, yeah, I can describe it kind of, sort of, but you had to be there. And,
pictures don't do it.
Not even close.
That's one thing I wish my first 3/4 of my career, I wish I had a camera. I wish I had taken more pictures. I took a few. I got to go to the altitude chamber at Kadena Air Force Base while I was in Korea because I was on flight status and the airplane was pressurized. That was a week, and that was pretty cool. Seeing the F-15s flying out of there all the time. So
there's a lot of exposure to aviation that I don't want to say doesn't exist anymore. I'm not calling you old, but yeah, like
the difference. Yeah, I mean, there was CH-46s flying everywhere. We had the Iraq Air Force was still flying F-4s. I don't know if they still are, but back then they were. We went down to Kunsan Air Force Base one time, and the place was just loaded with F-4s. It was so cool. Yeah, so it's getting ready. I'm getting close to PCSing and going to Fort Rucker to attend flight school, and there was another accident on Fort Rucker. It was a UH-1 burned in with the IP and the 2 student pilots. And I was like, geez, oh Pete, it's like right before I go to flight school, there's 2 Class A accidents, people are dying, and it was like, well, this is why I'm here. So I just kept the positive spin of it. I'm like, man, these guys are going to teach me how to fly freaking helicopters. Let's go. Let's get this done. So I go to Fort Rucker and get signed in, and those first couple of days are pretty stressful. Even as a young NCO, the TAC officers, the black hats, whatever you want to call them, the leaders, the drill sergeants of Warrant Officer Flight Training, Warrant Officer Candidate School, and at that particular point in time, it was 6 weeks total from start to finish. And at the end of that 6 weeks, you pin your bar on as a W1. And then after that, you start flight school.
And just to be clear, because again, silly Navy guy here, it's W1, W2, CW03, CW04. Have I got that right? CW05?
Nope. It starts with CW2.
2. Okay. So is it a distinction without a difference, or is W1, CW02? What's the delineation there?
I wish I had a good answer for you. So I think when I was going through CW2, you became a commissioned officer. So W1, you're not.
You're just a warrant. You're
not
a
warrant officer.
Okay.
Which is kind of crappy because I think in the Army, and I knew this from the time I was 12 years old, if you're a warrant officer in the Army aviation, you fly. That you are the technical and tactical expert of your whatever. And in my case, for aviation, it was to be a pilot. So you don't get pulled to all these staff jobs. That's what I was told. That's what I read. That is not the case. So we were not, by definition, you are an officer by warrant of the Secretary of the Army. The definition. The Army realized they had a bunch of officers out there that they could use for cheap labor. Because obviously a warrant officer does not get the same base pay as a lieutenant or captain or major or lieutenant colonel. So they commissioned us after CW2, which opened us up to all kinds of legal things that we could do. But I digress. So I was going to be a W1, and some of the old timers that went through before, I think, what year did they stop doing it? 93 maybe? 92, 93 time frame? I can't remember the exact time frame, but from the inception, you were a candidate all the way through flight school. You were not a warrant officer, and you were treated as such, and you lived in the barracks, open bay barracks, the whole time through flight school. And I mean, if you were married, you didn't, you get visitation later on, one night a week or whatever it was. I can't remember. So some of the old timers were like, man, this is some bull crap. A 6 week shake and bake, you're a freaking warrant officer, which You're still not really, because you still have all the flight school to get through. But what it did was it started your time as in rank as a W1. And it's 24 months. 24 months time and grade, automatic CW2, as long as you're selected and your OERs, your officer evaluation reports are on par and within the standard that the Army is looking for. And you haven't screwed up and got like a general letter of reprimand for, I don't know, a DUI or something, out drunk driving around, which, believe it or not, was still happening. It blew my mind how these guys, I mean, I knew from high school, my dad even said, he goes, listen, you cannot take a minor in possession. So I didn't do it. I told you I drank beer out in the woods, no driving, because I knew that was a big thing and I didn't want to risk it. So I'm in flight school. First couple of days are very stressful. You're getting yelled at. There's nothing you can do right. And it's designed that way. And I just remember thinking to myself, because some of these guys were wigging out, and I'm like, man, I will stand on my hands upside down in the corner of that room as long as I get into a cockpit.
I'll take the abuse.
You can't kill me.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So I know that's not going to happen. So let's just get through this. So the first 2 weeks was probably the worst. It's just nonstop. And they pick a guy in your platoon that's weak, and they use him to punish the whole platoon. That's typical. It's probably in every, I'm sure the Navy does it in boot camp and other schools. They pick somebody weak, and our guy, I won't say his name, but our guy he actually was a straight to flight school. I wouldn't call it high school because he had like an advanced degree in nuclear physics or something from San Diego State. The guy was intelligent to the level to where you couldn't have a normal conversation with him. And he did not pay attention to basic training, apparently, because he could not do some of the simplest things, to include PT, physical training, the exercises that we all have to do. Well, if things were going too smooth, one of our TAC officers would call him up to lead it. And then we knew that it was going to be a very painful morning, and it always was. And so they'd run us, they'd smoke us every morning. They wake us up in the middle of the night, make us do fire drill, just all that typical stuff. Do chairs in the hallway. Have you ever done that? You have to you have to have a 90-degree bend in your knees, and you put your back up against the wall. So you crouch down to your knees at 90 degrees, and you have to stand there. Try doing that for more than 15 seconds. Just crazy things like that. Bracing. You have to get up against a wall, and you have to touch your heels, your butt, and your shoulder blades and your head to the wall. Try doing that. It is very, very uncomfortable. And then, of course, we have, if you see a TAC officer from any distance, you have to stop what you're doing and scream at the top of your lungs, sir, good morning, or ma'am, and hopefully you got it right. Because there were some times where you didn't, because they weren't wearing what you thought they were wearing, and then you're getting smoked because of that. Anyway, so we get to flight school, we get out of walk school. It actually wasn't that bad. We graduate, and now the fun starts. Now we're actually starting to flight school. And the first thing you do is aeromed. So you do that. You get the spin chair and some of the basics of
Aero dunker. Is that part
aero
of it?
Medicine. No, back then there was no dunker at all for the Army until you got to a unit that was actually doing stuff like that. So in basic flight school, that was not it. So we went to IERW, initial entry rotary wing phase. And it's day one. You're in the Army had just taken delivery. They're only like a couple years old. The TH-67, Bell 206 L3 maybe or something?
B3.
B3, that's right.
Yep.
B3. Yep, B3. Pretty small helicopter, right? And they had started this thing where the guy in the back seat has the display in front of him to watch the instruments and the dash while the guy up front's flying, and all it did was make people yak. So then they started pulling them out. I mean, typical. But anyway, we started flying, and the first couple of days you're trying to learn how to hover. It's beyond frustrating. You're like, oh my God, I'm never going to get this. They're going to kick me out. I'm going to wash out.
It's not natural for anyone. No one I know, just like that first time, is like, oh yeah, that made perfect sense. It's not how you need those reps of feeling those weird inputs with a stick, with pedals, with a collective. Yeah,
but it was at the same time. Was maybe my third flight, maybe what we're looking at, like 5-6 hours ish, 7 hours. No, it wasn't that long. Somewhere between 4 and 5 hours. Boom. Holy shit, I'm hovering.
It makes sense.
Like, holy crap. now this is awesome. So you're trying not to freak out because you're actually hovering a helicopter by yourself. I'll never forget that. That was one of the coolest feelings ever. Like, I did it. Well, yeah, you've done it, but now, okay. So then we solo it like 12 hours, which looking back is absolutely insane. And our solo wasn't by ourselves. It was you and a stick buddy. But the IP gets out. All right, you guys take it around the pattern. And you're like, holy crap, we're by ourselves in this helicopter. I hope the engine doesn't quit because we're going to die because my autos suck. I remember autos just being so... They got fun. Everything was fun at the end of flight school, but at the beginning, everything was so scary because you're behind the power curve. You're not doing it right. The IP is being nice to you, but you know he's over there going, oh, Jesus, I don't know if this guy's going to make it. And we had a Vietnam veteran who was a retired lieutenant colonel. Roger Dillo was his name. And he was something special, that guy. He was, we would show up one day and he would not be there. We're like, oh, where's our IP? And the lead would be like, well, today's a Dillo day. He could just take the day off whenever he wanted.
A Dillo day. I like it. It's when your name becomes an adjective or a verb. You've done something right.
Dillo day,
Dillo day.
He was something else. He had a little sense of humor, but you knew when you were screwing up.
And were these civilian instructors?
Civilian instructors.
Okay, so that's something that's, I think, a little different from Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and maybe Air Force as well. For us, those primary instructors are, like me. That's what I am now as a commissioned officer. Yep. The Army, is it just because there's so many more people that you all have to make aviators that there's...
It's a lot, okay. Yeah. So it's, back then, I want to say there was maybe 12,000 warrant officers. There are a lot of helicopters in the Army and a lot of airplanes. So there's a lot going on, and these guys, the amount of knowledge that these dudes had was absolutely unbelievable. Now, we would have Army warrant officer pilots and sometimes lieutenant colonels come in and do guest periods, and our check rides were given by Army guys. My very first check ride was given by a CW4 Marine. That was his name. And I was a dumbass and made some kind of joke. I'm like, man, you should have been a Marine, like a dumbass anyway. But the check ride went well. And so it's probably similar to Navy flight school. Half the day is academics, half the day is flight line. And everybody looks forward to the flight line. Nobody wants to go to academics. But we had some ground instructors. There was a W-2, and he was old. He must have been like a senior NCO. He was a tech warrant. But it doesn't matter for like the ground instruction and warrant officer training, all that stuff. It could be anybody. And this guy was a tech warrant. I think he was like a nuclear missile warrant. But he was Ric Flair. You know the wrestler Ric Flair? When you get a chance to look up Ric Flair, this guy would come into the room and he was jacked. He was built like a freaking Hulk Hogan. Bleach blonde hair, tanned, and he would scream at the top of his lungs and, do the Ric Flair scream, whoo! I mean, it was unbelievable. That just sticks in my brain. So anyway, back to flying. So flying was fun. Of course, you get better every single day. Flying the CH-47 was actually, they were new helicopters, so they were fun to fly. They were very well maintained. And then we finished with IERW. Then after that, you go to an instrument phase. Okay, so it's an RTH-67, but this is a full instrumented, full IFR, new instructor pilot. And our instructor pilot was a retired CW4 who had retired from the Alabama Guard, who was also a Vietnam vet. And his name is escaping me right now. I saw him later in life at the clinic when I was going to school. But anyway, super great guy. And now I'm like, oh my God, instruments, this is going to kick my ass. That was the first time. In instrument phase, I was really studying a lot because it was just trying to wrap my head around everything that the Army wants you to do, time, turn, thrust or power, everything you have to do when you're entering, holding, coming out of hold. It just seemed like there was so much going on. And my stick buddy, through both those phases, a guy by the name of Josh Hill. He is currently an EMS pilot in Columbia, South Carolina. So him and I were stick buddies all the way through, and this guy was very, very smart. I mean, just super, super smart guy. He ended up being the number one in his class. He ended up because, I'll get to it, but when I got out of instrument phase, you went either the Huey track or you went the 58 track for combat skills. And it was all based on your seating height. If you had a very tall seating height, then you went to Hueys. Everybody else went scouts. I went scouts. He went Hueys. He was a tall guy. So he split us. We got split up. Anyway, so instrument phase was a hoot. You know, it builds confidence, but you're so far behind. You really don't know what's going on when you're that young and you're just trying to tread water every single day and not make a mistake. At least answer half your questions in your daily oral correctly and not feel like a complete idiot in studying. So that was a lot of fun. And it was during that phase that I actually met my wife through my folks up in Kentucky. So I was getting ready to finish up with instrument phase, and it went well. All the check rides went well, to my complete amazement.
It's kind of hard to evaluate your own performance, especially when you're that new. But yeah, I mean, you passed.
Right. You passed. I was like, "Are you sure? Did I really?" You know, like, yeah, you did. I'm like, oh, god dang, I can't believe that. So that was pretty fun. And I'm trying to think the hour level I was at about that time. So I was probably around 60 or 70 maybe total hours, something like that around. So I can fly the helicopter. I can, park it, do it when I point in the right direction. The only thing with instrument phase, we were not allowed to take off and land it.
Really?
Yep. We could only fly. We couldn't, once the instructor pilot took off, and most times we were in the clouds or on takeoff. I shouldn't say that. We had to do ITOs, right? Instrument takeoffs.
Yep.
But to and from a stage field, or when we went to park, we couldn't. For some reason,
these airplanes were just too valuable to
I don't
trust you all to land them, I'm guessing.
Maybe bang it up, I'm not sure, but the IPs did all that. And then so we got done with the instrument phase, and so now as far as timeline goes, I was very fortunate. I was in flight school, primary flight school, for exactly 12 months, start to finish. And then the Chinook came a little bit later, but 12 months of the actual flight school, which was crazy. So we get done with the instrument phase, and you're starting to feel pretty good about yourself. All right, man, I'm pretty good now. Now we're going to combat skills. And the first phase was BCS, basic combat skills. And like I said, I went 58 track. So we're flying 58 Alpha Chucks. Basic combat skills was absolute hoot. My first IP, he was kind of weak. He was a straight civilian guy who was in the Alabama Guard. Didn't really put a whole lot into it. I felt like I was maybe... These other guys were getting hammered every day, but if you're getting hammered every day, all you're doing is getting prepared for the final thing, right? And I felt like I was not quite being given the same thing. So
it wasn't as tough as it was for some of your buddies.
It wasn't as tough, so daily questions. The scout phase was pretty difficult because all these acronyms, you had to, all these reconnaissance things you had to do in the helicopter, and some of them are escaping me right now, but you had to be able to fly that helicopter tactically and report on enemy activity and then navigate. And so now, the summer is over. Now it's getting into fall. No, that was instruments. Now it's winter. Okay. So actually the navigation wasn't too bad in the winter time because you could see the streams a lot easier without the leaves on the trees. And the types of trees, all that stuff, we know that. And it was starting to become fun, though. So, now you're starting to answer pretty much all the questions correctly because you've learned how to study, I guess, at that point for these things. And the buzzwords and, loss of total rotor effectiveness. You start being able to, spit that out like you're not even thinking about it anymore because that was a real thing in the OH-58. This is 55 or 60
TH-57.
57, yeah, yep. For you guys.
TH-67 for you. Yep.
Same thing, right? It was kind of fun, but like I said, my IP was kind of a whatever. And then my stick buddy was, yeah. Well, then we finished up with that in our check ride. Well, on that check ride, the commander of the unit out there was now a warrant officer. He was a young captain. Sorry, this is before he reverted again. He was my platoon leader at Fort Carson in Quick Fix. He was a second lieutenant back then. So he's giving me my end of stage check ride, which was the coolest thing ever. And so went out there, did a bunch of autos, and it was just a hoot. So this is kind of a recurring theme somehow with me, running into the same people later in life at different stages of their career along with mine, just like with Sergeant Grubb. Now it was Lieutenant not Lindbergh, Lieutenant. It'll come to me. So we do my check ride. I pass it. Everything's good. Cool. Now I go to advanced combat skills, ACS, and that's when they start rolling in also NVGs for the first time. My IP then was cool as crap. Mr. Merrill, CW2 Merrill. Yes, he was related to Colonel Merrill of Merrill's Marauders in Burma campaign in World War II. Cool guy, man. He knew his shit. So he was hammering us. And we had to do like a high hover. I don't know if you guys ever had to do this. And we had to do a 360-degree pedal turn at night under goggles,
No.
OGE.
Okay, so
stay right there. Out of ground effect.
You use as much power as you can get out of the aircraft.
And in those things, man, I mean, you're at time limited, right? Maybe at the end of the period, you're lower in fuel, but dropping us off was an added measure of safety. And we'd watch the other guy go, gee. But we were doing, night autos, which first time scared the shit out of me.
You did night autos? No way. I have done exactly 0 night autos.
Yeah, it was not your happy place, I'll tell you that. That was a part of flight school where it was starting to come together. Like everything was, your confidence is very high. You know what you're doing. I can go out there and I can start this helicopter without even thinking about it. I can pick it up. I can hover. I can put it wherever I want. We were given the chance to do like a whole day of just us in the helicopter and going to different stage fields and RTs. Gosh dang, what do they stand for? RTs. Training areas where just out in the middle of the wilderness, there's a spot where we have to do our navigation training too. But you can go out there and train and do hover movements, your basic hovering maneuvers, aircrew training, manual tasks that were given to us. And so it was great. So we graduate. So now we're done with the flying portion. So now we have to go through what's called WOBC, Warrant Officer Basic Course. And that's the end of flight school. And that's when we had to do survival school or survival course, SEER. That was really fun.
Was that at Fort Rucker?
It was at Fort Rucker. And, it's just weird. I grew up kind of out in the woods and hunting and stuff. And it's just amazing how many people have never done that. So that really comes out then because, we have to kill a rabbit and prepare it and eat it, divide it, all that good stuff. I think it was like 3 days we're out in the woods. We're being chased by the Russians, and of course everybody gets caught, put in a box. You know how that goes.
Yeah, you can read about that online. Plenty of good stories with probably more information than needs to be out there.
That's right. Yeah.
It is really great training though. Like all jokes aside, I was
is.
on a foot of snow up in Maine, one of the coldest weeks of the year, and it was great. Like it was exactly what I expected it to be and more, frankly.
Yeah, it was. I'm glad we did it.
Wouldn't want to redo it, just to be clear.
I wouldn't want to redo it. And then later in life, I had to go to another specialized survival school based on the airplane that we're flying. And that school was administered by the Air Force. And that was that was scarier, but different. Like it wasn't you're out in the woods, being quote tortured or whatever. It was a completely different thing. SV-83. Have you heard of that school?
I'm not. I'm guessing it's probably more between the ears than physical stuff out in the woods of survival.
There's a little bit. You're right. There's none of that. It's almost all classroom, but you forget you're in a classroom.
Yeah, and that's what any good training does. Is you forget. You are right on that line. So
yeah, that was awesome training. That was at the Fairchild Air Force Base. So
when do you find out where you're going? So we've talked through SEER. You're done with, I'm guessing, primary. Where do you?
So at the end of OBC, everything you have done from your very first PT test to your last PT test, every test written, oral, check ride, every % of whatever you were given is tallied, and an OML is set up from the class first to the last. I think I told you we had 24 people in my class. It was a pretty small class, which as a side note, my year group of warrant officers was the lowest amount of warrant officers trained in a year in history, to the point where later on in life, I was promoted, which should have been my below zone, but they just merged us into the next class because there just wasn't enough of us. You see what I'm saying? So that was kind of a good thing, I guess you could say, because this was at the end of the Clinton, this is 97, 98. So there was no money. I know we had talked about it. If you selected Apaches, you knew you were not going to fly. I mean, we were counting printer paper back then. You know, it was crazy.
And again, we talked about it offline, but just to be clear, the Apache, obviously, what's the mission, right? Shooting the gun, firing the rockets.
Very expensive.
Expensive, yeah. So you're not going to be able to do that in a budget crunch.
No. And of course, throughout flight school, everybody's like, you need to go fly Apaches, you need to go fly Apaches. And they had aircraft cockpit trainers at the library that we would study at. And, you know, it was pretty cool. I'm not going to lie. It's kind of a sexy helicopter, right? You got these two big throttles besides you that you bring the engines up with. Then you've got the typical controls. The front seater has this crazy Cadillac controller, like a video game thing, and a monitor. And I mean, the thing is, you can fly the crap out of it. But everybody knew the mission, and like, man. Now there was a few guys. So we're at that point, right? Now we're all sitting in a room, and we're waiting. This has been the moment we've been waiting for a year. What aircraft are we going to get? And I had gone back and forth on my list of priorities of which helicopters I wanted to put on there. And my final list was Blackhawks UH-60 number 1, Chinook number 2, and 58 number 3. I didn't even have the Apache on there. And the reason I picked the 60 is because, you know, I had my first aircraft I was flying it, and I got some simulator time in it, thought it was cool. But the biggest thing was, for the most part, wherever there's a soldier in the world, U.S. Army soldier, there's a Black Hawk nearby, right? And back then, the Chinook units were there was only, there was Fort Hood, Fort Campbell, Fort Bragg, Hunter, Colorado, and that was it stateside for active duty.
Much smaller footprint.
You had Italy, Germany, Korea, Alaska. That was it. That was it. You had 9 assignments you could go to in the world to fly Chinooks. But it was a big badass helicopter too, because it's fairly intimidating. But it was a cool helicopter. You knew you were going to fly. If you got Chinooks, you were going to fly. So we all sit in this room, and CW4 that was in charge of it, which another weird small world. He's the father of one of my pilots that flies for Lifestar 3 down here in Gatlinburg for Lifestar, or not Gatlinburg, in Pigeon Forge, Sevierville, the airport, and just small world, man. But anyway, he comes in, W4, crusty old W4. He goes, all right, you guys, I told you that it could be turned off, but the faucet has been turned off, because up to my class OBC, for the previous year, it had been 80 to 90% Apache selection for everybody. Everybody was getting thrown into Apaches, and we were all dreading that. Well, he said, nope, it's an even spread. So there was 6 aircraft per airframe, which was nuts. Well, the number 1 guy in my class, his name was Matt Stauffer, and I would end up flying with him again years later in Germany in airplanes. He was a stud. Well, he was a Apache crew chief in his enlisted days, so he was always, I want Apache. So the number 1 guy, and how it worked is we walked into a room and all the aircraft were on the wall, and you selected, and you know, it's kind of like when the music stops, which chair are you in? Well, you select what's available.
You literally walk up there, take one down. Okay, yep. You're an Apache. You're a 60. You're a 47. Okay.
Yep. So we go in there, and I was number 8, if I remember correctly. The next 6 guys took all the Blackhawks. So I go in and there's no Blackhawks left. I'm like, son of a bitch. That's okay. I'll grab one of these Chinooks. And also, because I had been to Korea and I had asked for Fort Campbell because I was going to ask Kim to marry me, and she lived in Kentucky, I got Fort Campbell 101st Airborne Division, which I was pretty excited about. Because, you know, we were watching all these movies, 101st Airborne. I'm like, I'm going to be a Screaming Eagle. That's pretty badass. And I'm so glad that was my first helicopter assignment. So we got it. It was great. Graduate flight school. Boom. Awesome. My dad comes down, pins my wings. My mom helped. He got my salute. You know, that silver dollar cost me, if I remember right, $13 that I gave him for my very first salute. That's just pretty special. Smoking cigars. It was awesome. It was very great. I'm like, man, we made it. This is crazy. So I had to wait like 3 weeks or 4 weeks to go to the Chinook course. And in the meantime, what I did is I signed up for the aircraft survivability equipment, the ASE course, or electronic warfare officer. Every unit has a EWO. I'm like, well, that's kind of natural. I kind of know a little bit about that stuff. So I went to that course. That was fun. kind of scary because I learned about all the bad guys' capabilities that I didn't know before. I'm like, oh, wow, that's... and which helicopter am I flying again? Because every time the instructor said, anybody here can fly in Chinooks? I'm like, yeah. He goes, never mind about any of this because you're dead. And I'm like, oh, my God, what? Yeah. So I was like, well, that's just great. Well, so I finished up with that. That was great. Studying my butt off, you know. But I don't know what it's like in the Navy. So now I'm in a graduate program. It was totally different. This is almost like a gentleman's course. It was fan-freaking-tastic. Cool IP, Roston Henderson. The guy was cool as crap. You know, day one, cool flying story. I've been flying a 58 or a TH-67 on, you know, hot summer days. You couldn't pull all the power, right? We get into a Chinook. So there's me and my stick buddy, who I think he just retired as lieutenant colonel. Super cool guy. And we had a flight engineer. So a crew of 4 in the airplane. And I got to fly first. So Mr. Henderson takes us out to the stage field. We're going to do some flying. And, you know, first off, the size of the thing was just mind-boggling. You know, the pre-flight, that first one was pretty brief. You know, the first day was just, hey, here's the helicopter. Okay, front rotor, after rotor, or forward rotor, after rotor. Number 1, number 2 motors. Okay, cabin, it's huge. Cockpit, lots of space. Let's go. All right, so we jump in. He cranks it all up, you know, and we're just like, I'm glad they do that because you are not thinking, you are doing nothing except just looking at everything going, I cannot freaking believe I'm sitting in the front seat of this behemoth. I'm sure it was the same thing with the 53. You're just like, how am I ever going to get all of this?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
there's a lot going on.
And digest it and then be able to make a good decision so we don't all freaking die. Extremely violent death. So we go out there and it's, gosh, when was it? It would have been July, end of July, I guess it was. So it was hot, Fort Rucker, Alabama. And we're out there and we got a full bag of gas, which is about 7,000 pounds of fuel. And he lets me pick it up to a hover, and I pick it up to a hover, and I'm looking down there, and the torque gauges are right at 44%. And I'm like, does that say 44%? Because, you know, we did not do any PP C card. I had no idea what power was available today or any of that crap yet. I didn't even know what I was trying to do with this thing. He goes, yep, 44%. And I looked at him. I said, and how much is available? He's like, 100. I'm like, oh, my God. That's freaking, man, this thing is a beast, right? Like, we're empty. So that was great. So then we started doing our flying and academics and flying. And I remember the ground school was taught by NCOs, a bunch of staff sergeants. And these guys were all flight engineers. And they knew this aircraft better than I ever would. And they said this more often than I care to, you know, listen to. But he's like, yep, this part right here is a to kill you part. And I'm like, to kill you? To kill? What? And he said, well, if this fails, you're going to die. And there's nothing you can do to save yourself. I'm like, exactly how many of these parts are on this helicopter? Well, you know, there's a lot of redundancy, however, So the Chinook course went absolutely fantastic. It was fun. We learned a lot. We learned how to fly the helicopter.
What's something that someone who knows nothing about a Chinook might see or might be surprised with? You know, I don't know. I know a 53, main rotor head, tail rotor. In the 47, you've got, like you talked about, that forward rotor, that aft rotor, 2 engines. Obviously, it's all interconnected. But what's something that, you know, I would be surprised with, even with a little bit of helicopter time that I have?
Probably the biggest question we got is, okay, the engines power the aft rotor. How do you get power to the, you know, how does that work? And it's like,
I heard someone say, yeah, one engine powers one rotor, one engine powers the other rotor. It's like, that's a good guess.
Yeah, it is a good guess. But yeah, so there's 5 transmissions on that helicopter. And you have an engine transmission. Then you have a combining transmission, the C-box, which is considered one of the main transmissions. There's 3 main transmissions. And then there's piping coming off that going forward and aft to the forward, and then the aft shaft to the aft rotor. People are probably surprised, you know, how long a Chinook is 100 feet from tip path to tip path to blade tip to blade tip. The fuselage is 50 feet. You can fit a lot of stuff inside there. Like I said, you can put 2 Humvees in the inside of it, 2 Cutleys.
Would you say the most unique thing you've ever flown?
Here's one for you. While I was up in Alaska, We worked on a deal with the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and they had a bunch of archaeologists. If I'm using archaeologists, yeah. And they found a bunch of dinosaur bones up on the North Slope. And there were 2 dinosaurs. One was an ichthyosaur, and the other one was a pachyrhinosaur. Okay, so the pachyrhinosaur they found on a cliff along the Colville River, I want to say. It's this way up north to the point where we're using RCOs, and I'm climbing to 9,000 feet to try and get like a position report. You're up on the North Slope of Alaska. And they had gone up a couple weeks before I showed up for this particular day, this particular mission. And they encased, there was 3 or 4 of these pachyrhinosaur skulls in this grouping, and they had encased the whole thing in plaster and put a bag around it, and I had to sling it off the edge of this cliff, and I used the forward hook. I was flying with a lieutenant that was his very first RL1 mission, meaning RL is readiness level. So you show up to a unit, you do all these, you got RL3, RL2, and then RL1. So RL1 means you can go fly with any pilot in command in the unit and go do your thing. You've demonstrated the ability to do everything as required in the aircrew training manual. So his first flight was with me, way the heck up north. We had an extended range fuel system because we were going way up there. I looked at him and said, "Hey, sir, no offense, but if we're going to jack this up, it's going to be me at the controls." He goes, "You got it." And I'm like, "Okay, cool." So I slung it off there. We put it in the river, sandbar, the dry sandbar in the middle of the river. I dropped it, landed in front of it, off to the side, and then we winched it inside the helicopter, and then we flew it all the way back down to the University of Fairbanks. And I exceeded crew duty day because I had to. And then I got my ass chewed by my company commander, a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, because he was a really good dude. And I was one of the flight leads for the company. I was the operations officer. And he's like, "I don't want that lieutenant thinking it's okay just to call and get an extension anytime you want because, you know, that kind of thing." And I'm like, "Well, sir, I think he's fully aware that this was a very unusual." I mean, we picked up a dinosaur bones off the North Slope. That's probably the most unusual thing. Some of the heaviest stuff the Army uses in Alaska called a SUS-V. It's a Swedish-made tracked vehicle that hinges in the center. That's pretty heavy, right around 23,000 pounds. So you can hang 26,000 pounds on the center hook of a Chinook. You can hang 25,000 pounds if you're using a tandem forward and aft together. We try to use tandem, as you well know, because it's a much more stable ride. But super heavy stuff. In 101st, we'd move engineer battalions or forward support battalions, and one of the heaviest things was a John Deere 450 Caterpillar type bulldozer. Those were heavy, 23,000 pounds, I want to say. But those are very stable loads because they're so freaking heavy.
How many have you pickled?
I've never pickled a load and it burned in.
Okay.
I've had some keeper failures, sling keepers, an Avenger one time actually. And I was flying with another young guy in 101st. And
Avenger, that's a air defense system.
Air defense, yep. Okay. It's a Humvee with a very expensive turret on the back with missiles and machine guns. And the computer system in that thing is super expensive. Like I think it was like $1.something million piece of equipment, right?
Pretty delicate, I imagine.
Very delicate. We were picking it up. We had gone to the PZ, the pickup zone, to pick this piece of equipment up. And as we were bringing it up to a hover, I want to say the forward right sling keeper failed. And the vehicle tipped. It started to roll over on its side. So once it stopped moving, and of course everything is done in conjunction with your flight engineer, crew chief, telling us exactly what to do. He's in the hellhole in the center of the Chinook looking through the floor. So he guided us back down, and we set it back as gently, as softly as we possibly could. And then, of course, we had to land beside it, shut down, had to wait for the safety officer to come out because depending on how much damage was done to that thing, it's a whatever class accident, right? I'm like, well, crap, here we go. Somehow, by the grace of God, we had set this thing down to the point where even the mirror was in like a divot in the ground and didn't even get pushed in. A wrecker came out, they hooked up some chains, they put it on its wheels, they fired it up. There was absolutely nothing wrong with this vehicle at all. And myself and my co-pilot, we got coins out of the deal. Good job saving that piece of equipment. I'm like,
Did what you were supposed to do.
Did what we were supposed to do.
Yeah.
And then I had to. I guess we pickled it, but it wasn't like from a high altitude. We were doing an early morning air assault up in Alaska, and I was flying with Josh Hill. So my stick buddy in flight school. We both went to Campbell. I went to Alpha Company. I was a Predator. He went to Charlie Company. He was an Outlaw. We did our 2 years there. Then we both got Alaska. So we go up to Alaska. And he was also a flight lead. And we didn't get a chance to fly a lot together because we were both PICs. But when we did, man, especially like this particular flight, it was a big air assault, and I was the lead, and Josh is flying with me on this one. So it had just snowed almost 5 inches the night before, and we knew it was going to suck. We were doing long line, which, man, off the top of my head, I want to say somewhere around 200-foot slings.
Very, very long.
Very long.
Yeah.
And we have a SUSV, so heavy freaking load. And we went into the LZ. The PZ sucked. Just getting in the PZ sucked. But we did the pickup zone, and we were able to get down because the trees were pretty close to the strip that we were landing on, picking up the vehicle, so we had a little bit of reference. We still had to do quite a bit of a hover down to get in. So we get out, we lead the air assault, everything's going great. We go into land, and we're doing a hover down in this big, huge open field. I'm in the right seat, Josh is in the left seat because I'm running I'm the flight lead running the air assault, so he's flying left seat. And he's got the tree line on his side that he can kind of use. I've got nothing out my side, and we're looking straight down. And for anybody that's ever flown up in Alaska or anything where there's zero contrast below you, especially under goggles. And of course, we flew missions when it was zero or near zero ELUM. That's when we scheduled these air assaults.
So this is at night.
It's at night. Well, first thing in the morning. So it's winter in Alaska. So it's pitch freaking dark. I think it was like 5 o'clock in the morning, something like that. But it might as well be 2 o'clock in the morning right now. Well, you believe it or not, you pick out little crusties. So as you're hovering down, the snow breaks away, and then you see the shadow of your pink light, of your infrared, and then you can kind of, okay, I have a crusty. Or if the snow isn't quite as deep, there might be some grass still down there. You might be able to see some of that. If there's tracks, you can use tracks.
And now you have some kind of a reference.
Some kind of reference. Well, so we're at this point, and I'm looking at nothing but like crusties because I'm in the right seat, and I'm trying to help them, and the flight engineer's in the back. And we're coming down, and Josh he was not able to see very well. This cloud was unbelievable. So we started at right around, 600 or 800 feet. Then we came down to about 500 feet. And then we're at 300 feet. So the load's 100 feet off the ground, roughly. And we're starting to come down. And we get close to the ground. And I start feeling the helicopter kind of moving a little bit. And all of a sudden, Josh is like, I have no reference. You have flight controls. And the load's really close to the ground. And I was watching the whole time, and I was like, I have a reference. I have the controls, not a problem. Well, there was a little bit of a side slip built in when I got the controls. And as soon as I got the controls, we got fresh snow, and poof, we're inside the freaking ping pong ball.
You can't see anything.
There's nothing. Can't see anything. So I pulled the thrust lever to where I guess muscle memory took it. I have no idea. I didn't look at the freaking torque gauge. And as soon as I felt it starting to come up, I put in a shit ton of forward cyclic. And I could feel the helicopter starting to sway because with that drift set in, when I pulled that power, it threw that SUSV out to the side. And as I'm coming up, the thing starts swinging. We're like on a boat. I mean, I don't know how many degrees it was. I'm going to say 10 to 15 degrees this thing is swinging. And I'm like, gosh. And I'm watching the radar altimeter. So, I start getting some airspeed. Then we come out of the cloud. Luckily, it was a big, huge field. There was nothing in front of us. So we come around. We're entering the downwind to come back in again. Meanwhile, Chalks 2, 3, and 4 are getting their loads on the ground. And I'm like, son of a... it's like, oh.
This lead, you want to get it. You want to get it first pass.
Yeah, because now we're getting shot down, right?
Yeah.
If this was a no shit thing.
Yeah.
So we come back around, and we're we're still up against the trees. And I said, Josh, are you cool to put this thing on the ground? And he goes, yeah, I got it. I got the trees. We're going to come up. We've already blown out our spot, so we just got to come straight down. And we did. We did the exact same thing. We came in. It was not an event. We come down. We get to lower it on the ground. Josh starts to move over. And for some reason, the flight engineer doesn't release a load. And I think his hand fell off the joystick, the handle he has back there. So we're screaming, release load, because I'm looking for the light, and I'm not getting the light. Release load. So at about the same time, I'm reaching for the hook emergency release. We felt the tug. And then it let go, and then we stopped it. We were at a hover, so we set it down. And my crew chief's like, oh, it's on its side. I'm like, son of a, man, this night just...
Did all this work.
This mission can't, yeah. So, of course, we shut down. And sure enough, this SUSV is completely sitting outside. And we're like, well, so a safety officer comes out, and we happen to have a new safety officer, and she was a Black Hawk pilot. She wasn't even a pilot in command yet. And she's like, takes me off to the side. And so she's like, what happened? I'm like, well, this is what happened. She goes, well, you know, does Mr. Hill... I'm like, whoa. I'm like, there's another guy in this... There might be one other guy in this unit that I would rather be up here with than this guy. Like, there's nothing... She was just kind of going down a road that, you know, it's like, hey, you're the safety officer. How about you investigate before you start deciding on whose fault this is?
Let's collect all the facts. Yeah.
So they come out there, and same thing. They bring a big recovery vehicle to pull the thing up on its tracks, and there was one road wheel broken right in half. You know, it's cast, whatever. I guess steel or aluminum, whatever it is.
Probably takes a lot of force to do that too, if I had to imagine. So,
yeah. So it ended up being, I mean, the road wheel was only like a couple $100, believe it or not. So it really didn't register in the term of accidents. But we didn't have to piss and bleed, but we did have to go out and demonstrate that exact maneuver with the battalion standardization instructor pilot, who I had flown with before, done a lot of stuff. We did a lot of paradrops up in Alaska, which was a lot of fun, and the airborne troopers love jumping out of Chinooks.
Yeah, I want to ask about that, but before I do, I don't want to run past what you just described. At night, long line, very little external reference, in the snow with, how much does SUSV weigh? You said 23,000 pounds. That is challenging. That is not an easy skill set. Is this something you guys just did so much it became natural? It felt natural?
Well, you know, you wouldn't go out on your first flight and do that, right?
Oh, of course not, yeah.
Well, we'd been in Alaska for a while. I'd been in operations for a while, and we had done a lot of that training. We had done long line work also in NTC while we were at Fort Campbell, because same thing out there. That was actually scarier than the snow, in my personal opinion, because the brownout, I don't know what it is about it. It just comes, and it's, man.
It's a terrible feeling.
It's a terrible feeling, and you just, to me, the snow was, especially flying up on the mountain. You know, I was on altitude rescue team up there, and we'd fly up on the glaciers, mainly the Kahiltna Glacier. We did a lot of training on the Kahiltna Glacier and the Ruth also. But you would just fly upslope and just hold your attitude and fly right into the freaking glacier. You know, I forgot to mention, our helicopters have big skis on them up in Alaska. So it's like you're riding on a marshmallow. In the desert with brownouts, you know, you're coming in and you're doing, if you're not doing a hover down and you're doing like an assault, as you're coming in to land, your chief is calling out the dust cloud as it comes up the helicopter, up the fuselage.
Behind you.
You're hoping that your aft gear at the very least is on the ground by the time the dust cloud hits the cockpit, and then you put it down on the ground, so you maintain your straight forward. You stand on the brakes and you hope for it to stop moving. You don't hit a big hole in the ground somewhere. I knew friends that using that similar technique, crashed in Afghanistan. Hit a ditch, gear gets ripped off, the thing rolls over on its side, and rotors and shit flying everywhere. So the snow, pretty much any time I would much rather be up in a snow whiteout than the desert. But we learned how to fly up there in the snow. Maybe because I was a more experienced aviator up in the snow, I was more comfortable than I was, because I only had 2 tours flying Chinooks. I had the Campbell and then Alaska, and I think I flew like 750 hours at Campbell, and then I flew another 1,100 hours or 1,000 hours up in Alaska. And you learn up there with the flat light. I'm sure you've heard about the flat light where the horizon matches the ground. There's no horizon. The snow matches the sky. It's the exact same color. You have no idea where you're at. So you learn really to trust your instruments. And the funny thing is we didn't do a lot of instrument flying at Fort Campbell. I think we did one big instrument. You had to do your annual instrument check ride. But we didn't do a lot of instrument flying. I had one NTC rotation where we did a lot of instruments going and coming, and that was fantastic. But the Army's not really good at, we live in a VFR world, and we're learning how to do air assaults, and we have all this crap hanging off the bottom of the helicopter, and it kind of leads you into doing some scud running, which I did a lot of in those days. And I look back on that thinking, oh my gosh, that was not a very smart thing to do, especially between Fort Knox and Fort Campbell, but we did it up in Alaska. As long as we didn't have icing, Chinook can't fly in any kind of icing conditions. We'd fly IFR all the time, and it was fantastic.
You mentioned scud running. I think a lot of helicopter guys I know, there's a lot of threats down low that you're not necessarily aware of. And there's a friend I spoke with recently, and he's been doing this for a little bit, but he even made mention of the fact that some of the stuff he did when he was a little bit younger, there weren't cell phone towers. There weren't as many cell phone towers.
Right.
He said now wouldn't even consider it. But there were just less threats out there, or the environment that he operated in. It was an accepted thing. Unfortunately, I think we both probably know folks that aren't with us anymore because they've what's the terrible saying? You're not going to beat the low altitude record. All you can do is tie it. They fly into the ground. And that's something I'm kind of jumping off topic here. But when I brief double IMC, an inadvertent instrument meteorological condition entry. Basically, you're supposed to be VFR, VMC. You're looking outside, and then all of a sudden, poof, you're in a cloud. The first thing is climb, get away from that terrain, or get away from those known obstacles. Yep. And there's a story I know of recently where some folks were, I'll just come down just a little bit. We just popped into the bottom of these clouds, and they popped into some trees and tore the tail off the helicopter. And obviously everyone lived, thankfully. But it's not it's easy to say because there's that temptation, right? Like I want to stay VFR, I want to get to my destination. And, you may never get to your destination with that attitude, but it's also easy to be, I don't want to be judgmental because those people did the best they could. They weren't trying to have a mishap. They weren't trying to. No,
absolutely. They did the best they could on that day. Right.
Yep.
And part of it is, and I've talked about this many times, when you guys are at flight school in the Army, you're a VFR pilot and they scare the shit out of you about going in the clouds. You're going to die. Invert IMC, you're probably going to die. So let's come up with this huge complicated plan, especially if you're in a formation, not to run into each other. So what do? We do everything we can not to go into the clouds. And then later in life, when you become a more experienced aviator and you understand different things a little bit more, if you're flying along VFR, I've only gone inadvertent IMC one time in my career, and it was as an EMS helicopter pilot coming out of a rural field. And the weather forecast basically was an area forecast, but everything was looking good. And I took off. I was in Augusta 109, which is a fantastic instrument platform. And as I was climbing away, I was looking down at the lights of this town that we had just left, and the lights started to get very dim. And I was like, so I started kind of a small turn. Then the lights went away. I'm like, that's the end of that. So wings level. Airspeed comes back, power comes in, and we start climbing. But at that point in my career, it was a feeling of warmth and comfort as I start climbing away from the earth. And I was getting ready to call approach, and I came out. It was basically like a patch of little ground fog that was starting moving because there was a river not too far from where I was. But had that happened earlier in my career, I don't know, maybe I wouldn't have been so calm. When it happened. But that was also after 8 years flying airplanes where I lived
in the clouds, in
the IMC world, IFR world.
Yeah.
So I went from a VFR guy, scared of IMC, to use a term, maybe not scared, but, trying to stay away from.
Professionally respectful. How about that?
There you go. And then I started flying airplanes. Now I'm scared to fly VFR because my comfort zone is under positive radar control or on a flight plan, on a route, and the airplane's flying. Anyway, I just think the Army doesn't do a great job of preparing young aviators to be as confident as they could be in the IMC part of the world.
And it is a tough challenge. I mean, I'm not trying to undersell that, but by the same token, you want to be as tough as you can be in training. And when I say training, in a simulator, yes, but also in the real world. I had an instructor. It was one of my not quite aircraft commander, but I think it was like you had like a day check and a night check, and then your actual aircraft commander check ride. And on the day check, there was some weather up toward Charlottesville, and the night before, that's the plan I made. And I think I've been an instrument check in there somewhere too. But basically, that next morning, I came in and hey, there's weather up that way. I've got a backup plan to stay maybe in the Richmond area, do some approaches. And he goes, no, we're going to Charlottesville. I was like, oh, okay. And afterwards, after we did it, it was fine. We did the approach, in the rain. I was at probably the strongest driving rain I've ever been in a helicopter. And we come back, and he's like, if you're not going to do this on the good, we say good days, there wasn't embedded thunderstorms, right? There wasn't like a real threat to us. It was rain and it was cloud, and we broke out just fine. But the point was, if you're not going to do it on those days, the day you really need that skill set, you're not going to have it available. So
absolutely correct.
Challenging people in training and keeping yourself intellectually honest about that. Like, no, I need to see this with someone else backing me up. So one right. day when it's really challenging, I'm ready to go. No,
you're absolutely correct. And that anybody that spends a career in the military flying airplanes, helicopters, whatever, as you move along in your different gates, as you gain more experience, then that starts happening, and then you start being that guy. Hey, let me show you something, because I was where you are right now, and that definitely happened to me also. So Alaska was fantastic. It was the best helicopter flying. I mean, we were flying up and down the Yukon River, over top of fishing boats, and doing the dinosaur mission was amazing.
You talked about the rescue team. What was that assignment as part of your time there?
So the National Park Service contracts a helicopter to support the climbing season every spring, and that's to climb Denali, Mount McKinley. And if I'm remembering right, it's at like 20,320 feet, I think, is the peak of Mount McKinley. Well, the helicopter, and when I was there, it was a contract with Evergreen helicopter, and it was a Llama. It's a French-made frame with a bubble canopy and a big turbine engine, 3-bladed, fully articulated rotor system. It's a fantastic helicopter for that kind, and hence the name Llama. So hot and high, it's a very well-performing helicopter. Well, the problem is it's a VFR helicopter. So the guy they had contracting, this guy was he was a legend, I don't know how many hours flight time, but he looked like a helicopter pilot, big bushy mustache, long hair, dark glasses. And I mean, he would fly up on that mountain. He would do, short hauls. He could fly from the summit down to the high camp, which is at 14,500 feet. It's a hanging glacier on the side of the mountain. But a lot of times in the mountains make their own weather, right? And McKinley, if anybody who's ever spent any time in Alaska, you're very fortunate to see McKinley, because most of the time it's shrouded in clouds, because that's just the way it is. Well, he can't fly through the clouds up on the mountain. So the Army, in agreement with the National Park Service, we provide a service, and it's a crew on call, actually two Chinooks on call throughout the climbing season, and we're members of what's called it's High Altitude Rescue Team. So we train every spring on the mountain, and we have to go through the syllabus of training, and after your first year, you're eligible to become a PIC on the HART team. And we fly the Chinook to its limits in terms of altitude, because the surface ceiling for a Chinook is 22,000 feet. And we take them to 22,000 feet to fly over the top of Mount McKinley. It's insane. And, we're utilizing a Haas system on the helicopter. It's a helicopter oxygen system. It's a box that holds 4, and I can't remember the capacity of these oxygen bottles, but they're pretty good sized bottles. And these lines run throughout the floor of the helicopter, and pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer, crew chief. We have to pre-breathe for 30 minutes before you go high. But we did a lot of training. I mean, the highest OGE I ever personally did was at 17,200 feet, doing a pinnacle landing with the aft gear on the side of a mountain with 9,000 foot relief directly below me. I had no idea what I was looking at, completely flying the helicopter off my crew chief on the rock behind me.
There's nothing you could see to do it. Yeah.
Nothing.
You're just trusting their calls back there.
50 feet behind me is the helicopter attached to the side of this mountain. But it builds confidence, right? And my actual PIC ride was taking 3 external loads up the mountain. So the first 2 went to the low camp, usually fuel for the primary rescue helicopter, and then all their gear. So the Park Service has all this stuff. I mean, everything from food to toilet, water, everything has to go in there. They're little shelters. So you go in the low camp, which is 7,500 feet. We dropped the first 2 bags, and then we went high to the 14.5 camp, and we dropped the single bag up there, which was on a center hook. And then the inside of the helicopter was pretty much cubed out with, just dry good type stuff. And even up there, it was basically a pinnacle landing because the ground wasn't solid enough or level enough for us to actually land. Although, fun fact, the slope limitation for a CH-47, take a wild guess what it is.
Gosh, I'm not even going to be close. 8 degrees, 10 degrees.
There isn't one.
There isn't one.
No, if you've got the cojones to put this thing on the side of something,
Boeing's going to let you.
You're going to do it. And I've had a thing on some pretty crazy slopes. The scariest ones are down slopes. So Chinook is great for altitude, which is why you're probably seeing some of our NATO, because they're worried about high altitude type stuff, right? I've talked to a couple Marines, and 53 Echo is badass, but you get to altitude, it can't lift what a Chinook can. And the Army, who knows what the future is going to do, but in Afghanistan, that ruled to the point where there was the Air Force's, pararescue 60s couldn't do it. So they came up with a new organization. They were using National Guard Chinooks and with the PJ units, and the PJs would actually fly in the Chinooks and go where they needed to go up there to go after somebody for combat search and rescue or whatever, any kind of medevac support. So, yeah, that was a PC ride. And then also being at altitude, the helicopter's not burning as much fuel, right? So that was the first time we ever noticed that. It felt like we could stay up there forever, and then you could almost auto-rotate from 22,000 feet all the way to Talkeetna, which is where we were being based out of, and I think that was around 60 or 70 miles, something like that. It was it was a different world up there, and flying that helicopter in those conditions, talk about a confidence builder. It's a hell of a machine. And, of course, we had a lot of extra tools. We had tab data that you typically don't use in a helicopter, right? Normally, tab data is an airplane type thing. But up there, we had tab data that had been studied and gone over and approved so that we could go up and we could look at the current conditions, our weight, and then we would do a test hover, OGE, before we went to the high camp. And then we had to have a margin. And if the margin was there, we continued. If not, we flew around and burned some more gas off until we could do it. So it was a fantastic machine. And then when the climbing season was over, then we were released from that. But the Army has done some pretty amazing rescues up there. I personally was never involved in any rescues. But the highest rescue ever pulled off by Chinook up there was a couple climbers were in trouble. And I think they were either Canadians or British. I can't remember. But a couple of hard-charging CW4 dudes took a Chinook, and I won't say landed. They drove it into what's called the football field. It's a kind of a plateau just shy of the summit at 19.6. And they flew the helicopter into the mountain. It stopped moving. They loaded up, and they flew it off the side of the mountain. Yeah.
My gosh.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
The highest OGE rescue, I think they did a hoist with the winch through the hellhole. I want to say that was at 18.2, that was off, I think, the West Buttress. We'd have to look at that. But the point I'm trying to make is the Chinook is an amazing machine, and the Army has actually done quite a bit of work up there and helping folks out because we can fly through the clouds, or we can come in from the north where we don't have the clouds, make the rescue, and then we can go down to Anchorage and then get let down through the clouds, IFR, and land and take whoever we need to the hospital down there. So it's been pretty good stuff. If we had a chance to get to Talkeetna first, we'd go to Talkeetna, pick up a park ranger and a PJ. The Alaska Air National Guard has a PJ or a PJ unit up there, special operations unit up there that flies HH-60s, and I think they got a couple MC-130s, I want to say. So they do some pretty cool swoopy things up there too. So it's always fun working with those guys.